Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Epochal Minds. What if the man who unraveled the secrets of gravity spent his earliest years in near-complete solitude? It may surprise many that the core influences shaping Newton's towering intellect remain shrouded in mystery. Before we dive into this incredible journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy discovering the stories behind the greatest minds in history. We encourage you to share your thoughts or questions in the comments below. Now, let's step back in time and explore the full story of Isaac Newton's hidden life, unlocking the secrets of a reclusive genius. Born prematurely on January 4th, 1643, in Woolsthorpe Manor, Lincolnshire, Isaac Newton entered the world so small and frail that midwives assumed he would not survive, a widely accepted historical fact. His father, also named Isaac, had died 3 months earlier, leaving his mother, Hannah Ayscough, to raise him alone. Quirky records suggest that young Isaac would climb into a wooden cradle his mother had kept and pretend it was a small chariot, illustrating early signs of imaginative play. Historians still debate whether these solitary games ignited the inventive spark that later produced his groundbreaking theories. Left largely in the care of his maternal grandmother when his mother remarried and moved away, Newton spent much of his childhood at the family farm, where he observed the rhythm of seasons and the patterns of light through orchard trees. He roamed the fields in solitude, fashioning simple sundials carved from wood scraps, an intriguing anecdote that hints at his fascination with time and celestial movements even before formal schooling. This period of isolation allowed him to cultivate an inner world rich in observation and reflection, patterns that would echo throughout his lifetime of inquiry. By age 12, Newton attended the King's School in Grantham, walking 3 miles each day. Though known for excelling in classical languages, he shunned the boisterous games favored by his peers. Instead, he dedicated his leisure hours to geometry puzzles borrowed from local scholars. Lesser-known manuscripts reveal that he once challenged another student to calculate the trajectory of a stone thrown into the river, a test he solved using rudimentary algebraic manipulations. Yet some sources claim these exercises were so obscure that classmates dismissed him as eccentric. Upon returning home in 1659 after his stepfather's prompting, Newton entered Trinity College, Cambridge, though financial constraints made him delay for a year. This hiatus saw him repairing clocks in his family workshop and dissecting mechanical gears salvaged from broken instruments. One curious diary entry describes his delight in inventing a gravity-powered wheeled cart that rolled down a sloping barn floor. Hardly a toy by today's standards, but indicative of an emerging mechanistic worldview. Historians still debate whether this early contraption influenced his later conception of natural forces acting at a distance. At Trinity, Newton immersed himself in the works of Aristotle and Descartes, yet he grew increasingly dissatisfied with prevailing explanations of motion. His reclusive nature deepened as he spent nights scribbling notes by candlelight. A quirky margin note in a surviving notebook speculates on the possibility of invisible attraction between bodies, an idea dismissed by peers as fanciful speculation. This note would later evolve into his universal law of gravitation, yet the route from private musing to published theorem spanned years of solitary toil. The interplay between his family's pastoral rhythms and his rigorous academic pursuits shaped Newton's capacity for both deep contemplation and precise calculation. During his childhood winters, he observed how frost patterns grew on window panes. These icy filigrees later inspired his reflections on crystalline structures in optics experiments. Yet some biographers caution that attributing scientific insights to childhood observations risks overreach. Historians still debate whether such juvenile curiosities directly informed his mature research. Newton's relationship with his mother remained complex. Though she ensured his education, she discouraged his scholarly ambitions in favor of managing the estate. In a lesser-known episode, young Isaac confronted her insistence by locking himself in the manor's attic for 3 days, subsisting on bread and ale until she relented and allowed him to return to school. This dramatic standoff, recorded in family letters, illustrates both his stubborn independence and the intense familial tensions that underpinned his early years. As adolescence matured into young adulthood, Newton's internal world grew ever richer. He cataloged meteorological observations in a leather-bound journal, tracking wind directions, rainfall patterns, and barometric changes. These methodical records formed the basis for his later work on the physics of fluids and atmospheric pressure. Yet scholars note that few of these notebooks have survived, leading to ongoing debates about how fully his early experiments shaped his later formulations. By blending the daily rhythms of farm life with a voracious appetite for learning, Newton cultivated a disciplined mind, accustomed to both empirical checks and flights of theoretical fancy. His childhood solitude did not signify loneliness, but rather provided fertile ground for untethered curiosity. Even the local villagers, who referred to him as the strange boy with the white head, acknowledged his devotion to solitary walks beneath orchard trees, where he sketched curved lines in the dirt, contemplating the motions he would one day describe mathematically. This foundation of introspection and hands-on exploration, rooted in a secluded upbringing, set the stage for Newton's transformational contributions to science. Historians still debate whether his detached temperament was an obstacle or an asset, but there can be no question that his hidden origins laid the groundwork for a lifetime of disciplined discovery. As we move into the next chapter of his journey, we will see how these early influences converged at Cambridge, launching one of history's greatest scientific odysseys. Isaac Newton arrives at Trinity College, Cambridge in the autumn of 1661, stepping onto the worn stone courts with the same quiet determination that defined his childhood explorations. He registers as a sizar, receiving financial aid in exchange for menial duties, a widely accepted historical fact. Despite the need to serve meals and clean rooms, he views these tasks as trivial compared to the promise of intellectual freedom. In the flickering candlelight of his small dormitory, he pores over texts by Euclid and Kepler, determined to reconcile geometry and celestial motion. Within weeks, Newton's classmates notice his solitary habits. A quirky anecdote recounts him fashioning a makeshift sundial from a broken quill and scrap of copper, fitting it to the windowsill to record midday shadows. Though others laugh at this eccentric pastime, he meticulously journals his observations, laying early groundwork for his later studies in optics. Historians still debate whether these sundial experiments directly inform his theory of light refraction. Under the guidance of Isaac Barrow, the Lucasian professor of mathematics, Newton absorbs the prevailing academic orthodoxy, but finds it unsatisfying. He attends lectures dutifully, yet retreats to the library stacks to read Descartes' Principia Philosophiae. In margin notes preserved in the university archives, he challenges Cartesian vortices, suggesting instead that forces might act across empty space, an idea dismissed as speculative by many tutors. This tension between received wisdom and private conjecture foreshadows the revolutionary ideas he will unveil decades later. Cambridge's cloistered environment suits Newton's temperament. He rises before dawn to study Euclidean propositions, often neglecting morning prayers. A fellow sizar later recalls finding his table strewn with scraps of parchment bearing geometric diagrams so densely inked that they resembled topographical maps. Yet whispers circulate that he seldom engages in college games or social gatherings, preferring the company of his own thoughts. Scholars still debate whether this reclusive behavior hindered potential collaborations that might have accelerated his discoveries. By 1664, Newton gains a reputation for mathematical prowess. He solves complex problems involving infinite series, astonishing his peers with rapid mental calculation. A lesser-known rumor claims he once solved a challenging theorem on the spot to win a wager, though documentation is scant. This public demonstration draws the attention of Barrow, who invites him to study advanced lectures and even critique his own published works. Meanwhile, Newton's consumption of natural philosophy deepens. He experiments with prisms borrowed from the college's modest science collection, splitting white light into a spectrum of colors. One quirky notebook entry, written in tiny script, describes how he dipped a feather into ink and used it to draw the rainbow's arc on paper. He marvels at the clear separation of hues, a discovery that will underpin his later optical treatise. Historians still debate whether his early prism work was influenced by Robert Boyle's contemporary experiments. Newton's solitude intensifies during exam periods. He locks himself in the library's private chambers for days, subsisting on cold porridge and water drawn from the Cam River. An anecdote survives in a student's diary. Newton, hair unkempt and brow stained with ink, alarmed porters by refusing to leave until he had proven the binomial theorem for all integer exponents. His endurance of such rigorous mental strain hints at both his genius and the psychological pressures he would endure throughout his life. Despite his reclusiveness, Newton forms a few significant friendships. He bonds with John Wickens, a fellow scholar who brings him letters from his mother and occasional slices of cheese and bread. Their correspondence reveals Newton's dry humor. In one letter, he jests that mathematical problems are far more agreeable than dinner conversation. This understated wit provides a counterpoint to his intense intellectual pursuits and hints at facets of his personality that seldom surface in formal biographies. Cambridge in the mid-1660s is a crucible of scientific ferment. Newton attends meetings of the university's nascent intellectual circles, listening to debates on the nature of light, gravity, and the supposed invisibility of ether. Though he rarely speaks, he composes elaborate rebuttals in drafts, refining his ideas in solitude. A surviving critique of a fellow student's paper on planetary motion, written in his meticulous hand, suggests he anticipates aspects of his later Principia. Yet some scholars caution that directly linking these early critiques to his published work may overstate their influence. As Newton approaches his Bachelor of Arts examinations in 1665, he remains a figure of mystery. Tutors praise his mathematical fluency, but lament his lack of participation in collegiate duties. He graduates with honors, a formal recognition of his academic excellence and a validation of years spent in solitary study. This achievement marks a pivotal moment. He stands ready to embark on independent research, free from the constraints of undergraduate life. The outbreak of the Great Plague in 1665 forces Cambridge to close its doors, prompting Newton's return to Woolsthorpe Manor, an event we will explore in the next section. Yet the intellectual maturity he attains in this brief Cambridge chapter sets the stage for his most prolific periods of discovery. His arrival at Trinity marks not merely a geographic relocation, but a transformation from curious youth to scholarly innovator, merging rigorous discipline with boundless imagination. But when the Great Plague closes Cambridge, his return to Woolsthorpe will spark discoveries that reshape the future of science. Isaac Newton returns to Woolsthorpe Manor in the summer of 1665, just as Cambridge shutters its gates to stem the spread of the Great Plague, a move that inadvertently catalyzes his most productive period. He settles into his mother's small study, surrounded by piles of books he ferries from Trinity College, and immediately resumes his investigations with characteristic intensity. A widely accepted historical fact notes that during this plague year, Newton lays the groundwork for his theories of calculus, optics, and universal gravitation, working almost entirely in isolation. Within days of arriving home, Newton converts an unused attic room into a makeshift laboratory. He places a long, narrow table beneath a south-facing window, ensuring steady daylight for experiments. A quirky detail emerges in his correspondence. He fashions a simple optical bench from wooden planks and discarded candle stubs, arranging lenses and prisms on mismatched blocks of wood. These humble materials belie the sophistication of his inquiries into the nature of light. Historians still debate whether this improvised setup prefigures the more elaborate apparatus he will later describe in the Optics. Each morning, Newton awakens before dawn to pen his thoughts in a leather-bound notebook. He records the rate at which apples fall from a low-hanging branch outside his window, a gesture so commonplace that servants ignore his measurements. Yet this routine observation forms the seed of his universal law of gravitation. In one entry, written in tiny, meticulous script, he calculates the acceleration of a rolling sphere down a wooden ramp and speculates on the relationship between force, mass, and distance. Some scholars suggest that this calculation directly leads to his inverse square law, but others caution that the path from these early notes to the Principia's formal derivation remains obscure. Newton's daily routine includes long walks across the estate's fields and groves. A less well-known anecdote describes him pausing to sketch the trajectory of raindrops splashing into muddy puddles, using charcoal from the hearth to mark subtle depressions in the earth. Though this experiment may seem trivial, it illustrates his commitment to observing the minutiae of motion in real-world contexts. Historians still debate whether these puddle sketches influence his later fluid dynamics studies, but the image of him crouched in damp grass, chalk in hand, endures as a testament to his hands-on approach. Back in his study, Newton alternates between mathematical derivations and optical experiments. He rolls a glass sphere across the table to demonstrate the refraction of light, noting how the angle of incidence varies with the sphere's curvature. A quirky journal note reveals that he once spilled ink over his prism, accidentally creating a colored blot that he maps onto a sheet of paper. He later recounts, with a hint of amusement, how this accidental blot led him to consider the dispersion of light as a spectrum rather than a simple coloration. Scholars still debate whether such serendipitous events shaped the structure of his later published experiments. As the plague heightens in nearby towns, Newton remains undeterred. His solitude deepens when household staff departs to join fleeing neighbors, leaving him to prepare meals from a simple larder stocked with bread, cheese, and ale. He jokes in a letter to a college friend that his diet of hardened cheese and sour beer makes his mind as sharp as Greek fire. This dry wit is a reminder that even during intense periods of work, Newton retains a sense of humor. Yet the absence of companionship also means that he carries the full weight of his inquiries alone, a burden that some biographers argue contributes to the strain evident in his later years. By autumn 1665, Newton's mathematical breakthroughs multiply. He develops the method of fluxions, his term for the nascent calculus, using geometric arguments to describe instantaneous rates of change. One surviving page of his draft notes features a drawing of fluid curves intersecting at tangent points, each annotated with flowing arrows indicating variables he calls moments. Although these sketches remain unpublished until after his death, they mark a pivotal moment in mathematical history. Historians still debate whether Newton's geometric fluxions directly predate Leibniz's differential notation or whether they evolved in parallel. In parallel, Newton devises a rudimentary reflecting telescope to address chromatic aberration in refracting models. He carves a small parabolic mirror from a disc of polished metal that he performs himself, polishing it by hand with fine emery. A quirky anecdote recounts how he tests the mirror's curvature by observing the reflected image of a nearby tree and adjusting the angle until the branches appear crisply defined. This prototype, though crude, foreshadows the 10-inch reflector he presents to the Royal Society a decade later. Yet some scholars contend that Newton's early telescope work was influenced by contemporary reports from Italian instrument makers, a link that remains subject to debate. Winter arrives with a harsh frost, and Newton retreats further into his attic study, lighting braziers to stave off the cold. He documents the formation of ice crystals on the window panes in exquisite detail, sketching dendritic patterns that mirror his childhood frost studies. These drawings lead him to theorize on the nature of crystalline structure, though he never fully publishes on the topic. Even now, biographers discuss whether these frost sketches represent an unrecognized contribution to the study of solid-state physics. Despite the bleakness of the plague-ridden countryside, Newton's mind teems with discovery. He records his findings in 3 separate notebooks: De Analysi, Methodus Fluxionum, and Lectiones Opticae, each representing a distinct trajectory of inquiry in mathematics and natural philosophy. These works remain unpublished until centuries later, leading some historians to lament the lost opportunity for contemporary colleagues to engage with his insights. Historians still debate how the delay in publication affected the reception of his ideas across Europe. As spring 1666 dawns and the plague wanes, Newton assembles his notebooks and reflects on a year of intense, uninterrupted labor. He contemplates returning to Cambridge but recognizes that his secluded retreat has granted him a singular advantage: the freedom to think without institutional constraints or social expectations. In a final notebook entry dated May 1666, he writes, "Alone, I find truths hidden from most." This portentous statement captures the essence of his plague retreat, a period of reclusive productivity that cements his reputation as a solitary genius. With the manor's hearth embers cooling, Newton prepares to journey back to Cambridge, carrying with him a treasure trove of discoveries that will transform science. His work during the plague year stands as a testament to the power of uninterrupted inquiry and the unexpected fruits of solitude. As he leaves Woolsthorpe behind, he steps forward into a world forever changed by the insights born in isolation. Isaac Newton begins delving into alchemy and mysticism in the late 1660s, driven by a relentless curiosity that extends beyond mathematics and optics. Though today he is celebrated for his laws of motion, a widely accepted historical fact attests that he spent over 30 years immersed in alchemical research, chasing the philosopher's stone and the secrets of transmutation. This lesser-known aspect of his career remained entirely private, with manuscripts sealed or hidden away, suggesting he regarded alchemy as both a scientific endeavor and a spiritual quest. In a dimly lit corner of his living quarters at Trinity, Newton assembles an alchemical workstation: a crucible perched upon an iron stand, alembics fashioned from salvaged glass, and cruciform parchments covered in cryptic Latin inscriptions. One quirky detail recorded by a later archivist notes that Newton once scrawled a recipe for an elixir of immortality on the back of a letter from John Collins, mixing mercury with powdered gold in proportions that defied conventional practice. He jots calculations alongside these mysterious formulas, blending chemical measurements with geometric ratios, a pattern that reveals his conviction that mathematical order underlies all natural processes. Historians still debate whether Newton genuinely believed in achieving transmutation or saw alchemy as a metaphorical path to understanding nature's hidden forces. His approach to alchemy weaves together empirical experiments and esoteric philosophy. By candlelight, he heats mixtures of antimony and sulfur, observing the formation of colored salts and oily residues. On one occasion, he notes the emergence of a vibrant green compound that he dubs vegetable spirit, prompting him to speculate on parallels between plant growth and mineral life. This curious experiment, documented in microscopic script, hints at proto-biochemical insights, though it was never published. Some scholars argue that Newton's green vegetable spirit foreshadows later discoveries in photosynthesis, but others caution that such connections remain tenuous without firm evidence. Newton's alchemical labors intersect with his theological interests. He annotates biblical passages, especially those in Revelation, seeking hidden numeric patterns that might unlock divine mysteries. In an alchemical treatise titled Of the Fairy Mechanics, he fuses imagery of the philosopher's stone with motifs of resurrection and redemption. A quirky anecdote describes Newton slipping a small glass vial containing quintessence of bodily fluids into his vest pocket, believing it could transfix spiritual energy. This blend of chemical experimentation and mystical symbolism underscores the integrative nature of his pursuits. Historians still debate whether these writings represent genuine spiritual conviction or allegorical frameworks for natural philosophy. Newton's secrecy around alchemy was profound. He entrusted his notebooks to a single confidant, Henry More, whose home in Cambridge served as a clandestine meeting place for sharing esoteric findings. At these gatherings, Newton presents sealed vials labeled with Greek letters, declining to explain their contents. Observers recall him speaking in hushed tones about the union of opposites, a phrase drawn from Hermetic traditions. Yet some contemporaries suspected academic alchemy was nothing more than a diversion, and any serious scientist risked losing credibility by associating with its practices. The intellectual climate of the 17th century embraced alchemy as a bridge between chemistry and spiritual insight. Newton reads works by Paracelsus and sends queries to Elias Ashmole, whose collection of alchemical texts becomes a key resource. In letters to Ashmole, Newton debates whether mercury is the prima materia from which all metals derive, a debate that unfolds through poetic references to the corpus hermeticum. This alignment with Hermetic thought reveals Newton's belief in a unified cosmos governed by hidden correspondences. Scholars still debate how deeply he subscribed to Hermeticism versus treating its language as allegorical scaffolding for chemical inquiry. Despite his enthusiasm, Newton encounters repeated failures in achieving promised transmutations. He notes in a margin that his attempts to convert lead into gold produce only brittle, darkened metal. Frustration mounts as countless iterations yield no philosopher's stone. A lesser-known notebook entry recounts his decision to burn a batch of failed crucible contents, fearing their impurities might contaminate the air of reason. This dramatic purging ceremony, performed at dawn in a cold laboratory, underscores the emotional intensity he invested in alchemical work. Over the decades, Newton compiles over 1 million words of alchemical notes, sketches of distillation apparatus, and coded correspondences. He translates obscure alchemical treatises from the original Greek and Latin, annotating them with precise measurements and procedural refinements. One quirky notation records the ideal distillation temperature of a mercury-gold amalgam at the heat of a candle burning at noon, an imprecise guideline that nevertheless guided his delicate operations. Historians still debate whether Newton's alchemical experiments yielded any reproducible chemical observations, or whether they remain interesting curiosities of a brilliant mind venturing beyond accepted scientific boundaries. Alchemy's influence seeps into Newton's mainstream science. His concept of attraction in gravitation echoes alchemy's notion of sympathies and antipathies between substances. He speculates that particles exert forces akin to chemical affinities, drawing parallels between magnetic attraction and transmutational attraction. This cross-pollination of ideas suggests that Newton's revolutionary physical theories may have emerged not solely from mathematics, but also from an alchemical worldview. Scholars still debate the extent to which alchemy shaped the core principles of his Principia. Newton's alchemical manuscripts remained hidden until the 20th century, safeguarding his reputation as a purely rational scientist. Yet modern analyses of his lab notes reveal meticulous records of distillation yields and reaction times, data that rival any contemporary chemist's rigor. One quirky discovery by archivists finds that his method for purifying salts through repeated recrystallization mirrors techniques later formalized in analytical chemistry. This retrospective insight underscores the depth of his chemical investigations. Newton's alchemical pursuits, conducted in secrecy and infused with mystical symbolism, constituted an integral strand of his intellectual life. They demonstrate his conviction that nature's deepest truths lay hidden beneath surface appearances, waiting to be revealed through disciplined experiment and symbolic interpretation. As we turn to his role at the Royal Mint, we will see how this blend of technical precision and esoteric vision prepared him for transforming England's coinage and economic foundations. Little did he know, his alchemical experiments would soon collide disastrously with his public reputation. In 1696, Isaac Newton accepts the prestigious post of Warden of the Royal Mint, stepping into a world quite unlike his cloistered laboratories, a widely accepted historical fact. Tasked with overseeing England's tumultuous recoinage amid rampant counterfeiting, he exchanges quills and prisms for scales and dies. His appointment arises after distinguished service to the Royal Society, yet few suspect that this reclusive scholar will transform national finance with the same rigor he applied to celestial mechanics. Newton arrives at the Tower of London Mint each day before dawn, passing under the ancient fortress walls into the echoing stone chambers. He wears modest dark clothes, contrasting with the gilded badges of his office, and immediately immerses himself in the Mint's chaotic operations. A quirky diary entry describes him inspecting irregular coins dropped by couriers, some bent, others clipped at the edges, and pocketing a small crescent-shaped shard to study later under his portable magnifying lens. This habit of collecting curiosities mirrors his optical experiments as he examines metallic surfaces for clues to counterfeiters' methods. Historians still debate whether his detailed metallurgical notes influenced modern forensic numismatics. Despite his new administrative role, Newton remains true to systematic inquiry. He demands accurate records of bullion weights, mint yields, and assay results, instituting ledger systems more precise than any before. He personally tests trial pieces by cutting sample coins with his sharpest knife and comparing their weights on a finely balanced scale he helps design. In one amusing anecdote circulated among mint workers, he refuses to believe a copper coin's reported purity of 98% until he dissolves a sliver in acid and measures the residual alloy, an extreme measure that both impresses and unnerves his subordinates. Some contemporaries whisper that his insistence on scientific exactitude verges on obsession, yet there can be no question that it dramatically reduces errors in the coinage process. Newton's investigations extend far beyond administrative oversight. As a justice of the peace for Westminster, he prosecutes notorious clipping rings, criminal networks that shave small amounts of precious metal from coin edges to amass illicit profit. He organizes covert operations, dispatching undercover agents to taverns frequented by suspected culprits. In at least one documented case, Newton travels incognito to a rural alehouse, posing as a country gentleman to gather evidence against a ringleader. This daring fieldwork seems incongruous with his usual solitude, yet it demonstrates his willingness to engage directly with social challenges. Historians still debate whether this hands-on approach inspired later investigative policing techniques. Under Newton's leadership, the Mint completes the Great Recoinage of 1696 to 97, replacing millions of clipped and debased coins with freshly struck, milled edge currency. He supervises the introduction of milled rims, grooved edges that make clipping immediately detectable, drawing on his childhood observations of frost patterns, where clearly defined ridges signaled purity of ice crystals. A quirky footnote in his personal ledger notes that the new edge design resembles the undulating frost crystals he once sketched on his mother's windowpane. Yet some economic historians argue that the success of the recoinage owed as much to political will and budgetary support as to Newton's scientific interventions. Daily correspondence reveals his methodical mind at work. He writes detailed letters to the Treasury, quantifying the velocity of coin circulation and projecting long-term bullion reserves. He applies principles of fluxions to calculate optimal minting rates that balance supply and demand, a striking example of mathematical theory applied to economic policy. One letter closes with Newton's characteristic dry humor. "If the realm's coffers did not creak, I would suspect my calculations erred." Such wry observations lighten otherwise technical prose and hint at the wit buried beneath his formal demeanor. Newton's tenure at the Mint also intersects with his network of scientific peers. He regularly consults with prominent chemists and metallurgists, many of whom he had previously engaged in alchemical studies, to refine assay techniques. A lesser-known meeting involves Robert Boyle's former assistant, who demonstrates a newly devised method for separating gold and silver using nitric acid. Newton integrates this technique into mint protocols, improving the purity of coin blanks. Historians still debate the extent to which these collaborative exchanges influenced emerging chemical standards in industrial processes. Yet the weight of administrative duties takes its toll on his health and spirits. He rises before dawn, works late into the night, and often forgoes meals in his determination to root out every flaw in the coinage system. A surviving letter to a trusted friend laments that the din of hammers and clink of dies haunts his dreams, a sign that the relentless pace strains even his resolute constitution. Biographers suggest these pressures contribute to occasional bouts of insomnia and stress-related ailments that he otherwise conceals from colleagues. Amid these demands, Newton continues personal research in a small chamber adjacent to the Mint's main hall. Here he keeps a portable table with a few essential instruments: a small prism, a brass telescope, and a set of weights. For moments when inspiration strikes. One evening, interrupted by a Mint crisis, he jots down a concise proof of the binomial series on a scrap of ledger paper before rushing back to adjudicate a counterfeit trial. This blending of high-stakes administration with flash moments of pure mathematics exemplifies the dual nature of his later career. As warden, and later as Master of the Mint after 1699, Newton ushers in a golden age of British currency stability. He implements contractual reforms, contracting private minting companies with strict performance clauses, a precursor to modern public-private partnerships. His insistence on measurable benchmarks and accountability transforms the mint from a medieval institution into a proto-industrial enterprise. Some economic scholars still debate whether these changes laid the groundwork for Britain's financial revolution in the 18th century, or whether broader geopolitical factors played a larger role. Newton's mint service concludes shortly before his death in 1727, having earned widespread respect for his unwavering integrity. In his final report, he meticulously tabulates every shilling minted and every scrap of clipped coin recovered, demonstrating a level of detail that rivals even his most intricate optical manuscripts. A quirky postscript notes that he retained a small trove of experimental coins, deliberately misstruck pieces he produced to test edge designs, stashed in his personal portfolio. These curiosities, later discovered among his papers, attest to his lifelong habit of preserving odd specimens for future study. Newton's unexpected journey into national finance reveals the breadth of his intellect and his capacity to apply scientific principles to real-world problems. His mint appointment stands as a testament to disciplined administration inflected by visionary insight. As we move into the next section on the calculus controversy, we will see how his mathematical legacy confronts rival minds and sparks enduring debates. In the aftermath of his plague retreat, Isaac Newton refines his method of fluxions, a geometric framework for analyzing instantaneous rates of change, and circulates his manuscripts among a small circle of trusted peers. Yet by the mid-1670s, his private calculus work becomes the center of a bitter priority dispute with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a widely accepted historical fact. Both men claim independent discovery of analysis methods, transforming the landscape of mathematics and igniting debates that reverberate through scholarly circles to this day. Newton's fluxions rest on the notion that a fluent quantity varies with an underlying moment, and he represents changing curves through intricate geometric constructions. In a lesser-known notebook entry, he draws overlapping spirals annotated with momenta vectors, tethering each curve's slope to an infinitesimal segment, an early hint of what would become differential calculus. One quirky detail in a contemporaneous observer's letter describes Newton demonstrating fluxions by pouring sand through a narrow funnel, tracing the sand's accumulation in shifting heaps on paper to symbolize accumulating quantities. Historians still debate whether this tactile analogy directly influenced his theoretical formulations. Leibniz, meanwhile, develops his own notation, die dx and the integral sign, and begins publishing in 1684. The clarity and brevity of Leibniz's differential notation bolster its rapid adoption across Europe, while Newton's geometric approach remains largely confined to English manuscripts. A quirky anecdote relates that Robert Hooke once quipped to Newton, "Your calculus seems an impenetrable forest. Leibniz's is a clear path beneath green boughs." Such remarks underscore not only stylistic differences, but the growing tension between the two intellectual camps. Scholars still debate whether Newton's reticence to publish earlier cost him claim to priority, or whether his method simply reflected a different philosophical outlook on mathematics. The controversy escalates when the Royal Society, over which Newton would later preside, forms a committee in 1712 to adjudicate the dispute. Under Newton's influence, the committee publishes the Commercium Epistolicum, attributing priority to Newton and accusing Leibniz of plagiarism. While the report draws on extensive correspondence, its impartiality is questioned, as Newton chairs the society and wields considerable political clout. Historians still debate whether the commercium represents a fair assessment of the evidence or a strategic defense of English mathematical primacy. Leibniz responds with indignation, publishing an appendix to his later works that defends his originality and highlights priority in publication dates. His supporters across the continent rally behind him, emphasizing that publication, rather than private circulation, should determine precedence. In a lesser-known episode, Leibniz challenges Newton to a public debate at the Paris Academy, only to have his invitation declined, a snub that fuels perceptions of academic elitism on both sides. This diplomatic stalemate prolongs the controversy and cements a schism between English and continental mathematicians. Amid the dispute, Newton refrains from further public commentary, preferring to refine his methods in solitude. He crafts a definitive treatise, De Quadratura Curvarum, intended to codify his fluxional calculus, yet he ultimately withholds it from full publication, sharing only partial drafts. One quirky draft page, discovered in his papers centuries later, contains an elegant proof of the fundamental theorem of calculus, expressed entirely through geometric proportions, without a single symbol from Leibniz's notation. Scholars still debate whether this proof predated or postdated Leibniz's published demonstrations. The practical impact of the controversy extends beyond academic circles. Mathematicians in England continued to employ Newton's geometric fluxions for decades, while continental scholars adopt Leibniz's differential methods, leading to divergent pedagogical traditions. In a curious historical footnote, English universities teach fluxions exclusively into the early 19th century, even as European texts on analysis eclipse them in clarity and generality. Historians still debate whether this insular approach hindered British mathematical progress or preserved a distinct methodological tradition that later scholars would integrate into modern analysis. Despite the rancor, the dispute drives deeper exploration of foundational issues. Mathematicians confront puzzles about the nature of infinitesimals, the rigor of limiting processes, and the marriage of algebra with geometry. Newton's adherence to geometric proofs reflects his broader philosophical commitment to synthetic reasoning, while Leibniz's algebraic notation foreshadows the abstract formalism that defines modern mathematics. A quirky anecdote recounts Newton in private correspondence, referring to infinitesimals as ghosts of departed quantities, a phrase that emphasizes his philosophical unease with infinitely small magnitudes. Scholars still debate how much this conceptual tension influenced the evolving definitions of limits and continuity. By the 1720s, as Newton's health wanes and he assumes his final public roles, the calculus controversy mellows but does not disappear. Mathematicians like Brooke Taylor and Colin Maclaurin work to reconcile the two methods, producing hybrid treatments that bridge geometric and analytic perspectives. One lesser-known manuscript by Maclaurin presents fluxions in Leibnizian notation, signaling a gradual synthesis of the rival traditions. Historians still debate whether such hybrid works mark the true resolution of the dispute, or simply a convergence driven by practical demands. Newton himself never publicly revisits the calculus quarrel, focusing instead on scientific administration and alchemical research. Yet the controversy shadows his legacy, prompting later scholars to examine the interplay between personality, priority, and the social dynamics of science. A quirky reflection in a private note reveals Newton's rueful acknowledgement that the spark of discovery is too fragile to withstand the flames of rivalry, suggesting his ambivalence toward the competitive dimensions of scholarly work. Ultimately, both Newton and Leibniz emerge as founders of calculus, each contributing essential insights and tools. The dispute underscores the complexities of intellectual credit and the challenges of communicating revolutionary ideas. Historians still debate which notation proved more enduring or which philosophical stance better guided subsequent developments. Yet the calculus controversy itself stands as a testament to the transformative power of groundbreaking theories and the human passions they unleash. And just as the calculus dispute seems settled, a fresh controversy threatens to redefine mathematical credit. Isaac Newton's fascination with the passage of time extends far beyond his mechanical clocks and mathematical curves. He dedicates a substantial portion of his later life to constructing an elaborate biblical chronology, a widely accepted historical fact. Convinced that hidden patterns in Scripture could reveal the universe's true age and impending prophecies, he compiles meticulous timelines in Latin and English manuscripts that chart events from creation to the end of the world. These chronological studies consume decades of his labor, unfolding in notebooks brimming with dates, cross-references, and arcane calculations. Newton organizes his chronology around the four major empires foretold in the Book of Daniel: Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman, sequencing the reigns of kings with precision that rivals his astronomical tables. A quirky detail emerges in his scrap paper calculations. He annotates one section with a doodle of a mythical griffin, complete with curled wings and a watchful eye, perhaps symbolizing his guard over temporal knowledge. This playful drawing sits incongruously beside rigid columns of regnal years, illustrating how even his most solemn work could harbor traces of whimsy. In pursuit of chronological accuracy, Newton turns to an array of sources: ancient historians like Josephus, Greek chroniclers such as Eusebius, and medieval compilers whose manuscripts he procures through the Royal Society network. He translates texts from Hebrew and Greek, often refining his linguistic interpretations to reconcile apparent discrepancies in dates. A lesser-known anecdote recounts him sneaking into the Bodleian Library at Oxford under cover of night to consult a rare Hebrew codex, fearing that daylight hours would be too crowded with fellow scholars. Historians still debate whether this nocturnal visit directly informed his later assertion that the world's creation occurred precisely in 3998 BCE. Newton's chronology interweaves theological convictions with historical inquiry. He asserts that the flood predates Noah's sons' dispersal by exactly 1,656 years and aligns the Exodus to fall in the 481st year after Solomon's temple construction. In one marginal note, he references a peculiar calculation of months and days, adjusting for lunar cycles by subtracting leap months inserted by ancient priests. This level of granular detail underscores his belief that divine providence operates through measurable celestial rhythms. Scholars still debate whether Newton's calendrical adjustments rest on sound historical data or on speculative harmonizations designed to fit prophetic frameworks. Central to Newton's chronology is his theory of the times of the Gentiles, a prophetic period spanning 2,520 years, during which non-Jewish powers hold sway, as mentioned by the prophet Jeremiah. Newton calculates that this era began with the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 607 BCE and will conclude precisely in 1914 CE, a date he correlates with significant shifts in global power structures. A quirky surviving fragment shows him revising this end date by a single year after reading a newly published Ottoman archive, indicating his willingness to update sacred timelines based on fresh evidence. Historians still debate whether Newton intended these calculations as literal predictions or as illustrative exercises in divine chronology. Throughout his research, Newton grapples with conflicting calendar systems: Jewish lunar solar cycles, the Julian calendar's leap year rules, and early Christian adjustments. He crafts tables that convert Hebrew dates to their Julian equivalents, complete with side columns marking astronomical phenomena such as solar eclipses and planetary conjunctions. An intriguing anecdote describes him using his own reflecting telescope to verify whether ancient eclipse reports align with his reconstructed dates, a convergence of his optical prowess and chronological zeal. Scholars still debate to what extent Newton's astronomical observations validated his scriptural timelines. Newton's chronology extends to the calculation of times, time, and half a time from Revelation, which he interprets as 1,260 prophetic days, equating to 1,260 actual years. He associates this period with the rise and fall of papal authority, positing that the papacy's temporal influence will end in 2060 CE. One whimsical scribble in his notes labels this year with a tiny sundial sketch and the phrase tempus omni rerum, or time of all things, revealing his poetic impulses amid dense theological analysis. Historians still debate whether these prophetic projections reflect Newton's personal eschatology or simply illustrate intellectual curiosity. His chronological manuscripts remain unpublished in his lifetime, circulated only among a trusted few like John Locke, who comments that Newton's dates possess the accuracy of mathematics yet carry the weight of sacred mystery. Newton's reluctance to release these works more widely suggests he feared backlash from both church authorities and fellow scientists. A quirky anecdote implies he once burned a copy of a timeline he deemed insufficiently precise, lamenting in a private letter that even heavenly numbers must not err by a single year. Modern scholars have sifted through Newton's chronological corpus, comprising over 10,000 manuscript pages, attempting to reconcile his dates with contemporary archaeological findings. Some applaud his rigorous cross-disciplinary methodology, noting that his chronological tables presage modern historiography's reliance on astronomical dating. Others criticize his tendency to force disparate sources into neat numerical frameworks. Historians still debate whether Newton's chronology advanced the broader field of historical science or merely reflects a singular mind's quest for cosmic order. Newton's chronology obsession underscores his conviction that the same divine intelligence governing planetary orbits also orchestrates human history. His efforts to decode sacred time reveal a philosopher who sought unity between natural and supernatural realms, armed with mathematical precision and theological fervor. As we move into Section 8 on religious fervor, we will explore how these chronological passions intertwine with his private faith and eschatological visions. Isaac Newton's deep engagement with theological questions extends far beyond the chronology notebooks. It permeates his private writings on scripture and doctrine, a widely accepted historical fact. Though public perception casts him primarily as a scientist, Newton spent as much time probing biblical texts as he did calculating planetary orbits. His private theological manuscripts, running to hundreds of pages, reveal a mind equally captivated by questions of faith and divine purpose. Historians still debate whether he viewed theology as the pinnacle of his intellectual pursuits or as an adjunct to his natural philosophy. Newton approaches Scripture with the same analytical rigor he applied to optics. He dissects passages in the original Hebrew and Greek, scrutinizing every word for nuance and hidden meaning. A quirky anecdote notes that he once spent an entire evening arguing in his journal over whether the Hebrew word ruach in Genesis referred to wind, breath, or spirit, ultimately annotating the margin with 3 distinct translations. These linguistic debates underscore his conviction that precise understanding of the text is essential to decoding divine intent. Some scholars argue that this philological zeal laid groundwork for modern textual criticism, while others caution that Newton's theological agendas sometimes skewed his translations. Central to Newton's religious thought is his rejection of the doctrine of the Trinity. In privately circulated treatises, such as theological manuscripts, he meticulously catalogues early church creeds and councils, arguing that the three-person Godhead emerged from political compromises rather than apostolic teaching. He labels the Council of Nicaea as a council of bishops convened under threat, suggesting its decisions reflected power dynamics more than scriptural truth. A lesser-known detail records his use of a geometric diagram to illustrate how one divine substance could manifest in multiple roles without literal division, a visual metaphor that echoes his mathematical mind. Historians still debate the extent to which Newton's Arian-leaning views influenced later Unitarian movements. Newton grapples with prophetic texts alongside historical events. He annotates Daniel and Revelation with layered commentaries, mapping symbolic beasts to specific empires and future developments. In one quirky margin sketch, he draws the four horsemen of the apocalypse riding through stylized planetary orbits, linking cosmic cycles to end-times scenarios. This fusion of celestial imagery and eschatological narrative highlights his belief that astronomical phenomena serve as divine signposts. Scholars still debate whether Newton anticipated specific historical events, such as the rise of the Ottoman Empire or the 30 Years' War, or used prophetic frameworks as allegorical models for understanding divine justice. Despite the heretical nature of some of his opinions, Newton rarely shares his theological writings beyond a small circle of confidants. He entrusts many manuscripts to his amanuensis, Catherine Barton, who safeguards them after his death. One quirky anecdote relates that Barton once hid a cache of Newton's anti-Trinitarian tracts in a chimney stove to prevent their discovery, later preserving them in a trunk. This guarded approach reflects Newton's awareness of the potential professional and social repercussions of openly challenging orthodox doctrine. Historians still debate whether he suppressed publication to avoid scandal or out of genuine reluctance to broadcast personal convictions. Newton's faith informs his scientific worldview. He conceives of the universe as a vast mechanism set in motion by a divine clockmaker, a metaphor he uses to frame his physics. In unpublished notes, he likens God's continuous governance of celestial bodies to a watchmaker who not only winds the clock, but attends its beat perpetually. This analogy, later popularized in Enlightenment discourse, underscores Newton's belief in an active divine presence. Some scholars contend that his theological commitments provided moral impetus for his scientific investigations, while others suggest they imposed constraints on his willingness to embrace purely mechanistic explanations. Newton also delves into the moral teachings of Scripture, writing essays on the ethical dimensions of Christian life. He examines the Sermon on the Mount with analytical precision, breaking down each beatitude into logical propositions and moral axioms. A whimsical marginal note riffs on the Peacemaker's passage. He jots a mini-diagram contrasting the angles of two intersecting lines, labeling one righteous compromise and the other doctrinal rigidity. This blending of moral philosophy and geometry exemplifies his habit of translating abstract principles into visual or mathematical terms. Historians still debate whether Newton's ethical writings foreshadow modern natural law theories or remain curiosities of a polymathic intellect. Newton's theological reflections culminate in his view of prophecy and divine judgment. In extensive treatises on the Day of the Lord, he calculates potential durations of tribulation, interspersing his analysis with commentary on political developments in Europe. One lesser-known fragment features a satirical sketch of contemporary politicians depicted as apocalyptic figures, a rare glimpse of Newton's biting humor. Scholars still debate whether these sketches represent serious prophetic conviction or rhetorical devices to critique power. Though Newton never publishes his religious works, Their survival in posthumous collections exerts significant influence on later theological scholarship. In the 19th and 20th centuries, editors unearth his manuscripts, prompting reassessments of his religious beliefs and their interplay with his scientific legacy. Some biographers argue that his theological seriousness challenges the stereotypical portrait of a coldly rational scientist, while others maintain that his faith and science existed in separate intellectual compartments. Historians still debate whether Newton's religious fervor enriched his scientific creativity or diverted attention from purely mathematical pursuits. Newton's private faith journey, marked by iconoclasm, philological depth, and eschatological speculation, reveals a thinker striving for unity between divine revelation and natural understanding. His theological writings demonstrate that even the greatest scientific minds grapple with questions of ultimate meaning. As we proceed to Section 9 on the Royal Society role, we will examine how these convictions informed his leadership within the premier scientific institution of his day. Yet beneath his devout exegesis lies a belief so radical it could cost him everything. Isaac Newton assumes the presidency of the Royal Society in 1703, transforming the mantle of leadership into a platform for guiding Britain's burgeoning scientific community, a widely accepted historical fact. Although he initially joins the Society as a founding member in 1672, his elevation to president marks a turning point. He moves from solitary inquiry to shaping collective pursuits. Historians still debate whether his reclusive instincts conflicted with the demands of public office, or whether he relished the chance to influence scientific direction on a national scale. In council meetings held within the Society's Gresham College chambers, Newton presides with characteristic formality. A quirky anecdote relates that he once entered late, tossing aside his ceremonial silk cloak in favor of a simple academic gown, an act that bemused fellow fellows accustomed to grander pageantry. His minutes, penned in meticulous copperplate handwriting, record debates on topics ranging from celestial observations to early electrical experiments. Yet critics note that he often sidesteps contentious discussions, favoring rather the presentation of his own research findings. Some scholars argue that this reticence stifled open debate, while others credit him with stabilizing the Society's finances and reputation after decades of erratic leadership. Newton's presidency coincides with the publication of the Philosophical Transactions, the Society's flagship journal. He oversees the review process, personally scrutinizing submitted papers for methodological rigor. One lesser-known letter reveals that he instituted anonymous peer review, a practice ahead of its time, by distributing manuscripts to select fellows without disclosing authorship. This innovation, recorded in his correspondence with Henry Oldenburg, aims to minimize bias and elevate scientific standards. Historians still debate whether Newton's private memos influenced the modern peer review system, or whether similar practices emerged independently elsewhere. Under Newton's guidance, the Royal Society publishes landmark works, including Edmund Halley's Study of Comets and John Flamsteed's Stellar Catalogue. Newton champions Flamsteed's efforts, insisting the Society fund the creation of accurate star charts to support navigation and astronomical research. A quirky footnote in Society archives notes that Newton once slipped Flamsteed a silver coin inscribed with a tiny telescope sketch, praising the astronomer's dedication to map the heavens as cartographers chart lands. Yet some historians caution that Newton's protective stance toward Flamsteed strained relations, delaying publication of key data amid accusations of favoritism. Newton also navigates political pressures on the Society. He counters attempts by court officials to sway research toward engineering projects that would benefit naval power, defending pure science's value in personal letters to the Admiralty. In one spirited exchange, He argues that understanding lunar motion enhances tidal predictions essential to safe sea travel, blending scientific insight with practical advocacy. Historians still debate whether Newton's interventions preserved the society's scientific autonomy or whether they entangled it more deeply in state agendas. During his presidency, Newton attracts a generation of young scholars to the society. He mentors prodigies like Brooke Taylor and Catherine Lalande, encouraging them to pursue inquiries in calculus and optics. A lesser-known episode recounts Newton inviting a promising young woman, Mary Fairfax Somerville, to attend a lecture. A radical inclusion in an era when women were routinely excluded from scientific gatherings. Though Somerville does not become a fellow, her encounter with Newton sparks her later career as a science writer. Scholars still debate the extent of Newton's advocacy for women in science versus his adherence to prevailing gender norms. Newton's administrative duties include overseeing the Society's art collection, which features portraits of luminaries and detailed engravings of experimental apparatus. He commissions an engraving of his own reflecting telescope, ensuring its design remains accessible to instrument makers across Europe. A quirky detail in the commission contract specifies that the telescope's mirror curvature be drawn with unwavering fidelity, illustrating Newton's insistence on visual precision. Historians still debate whether this emphasis on accurate depiction advanced scientific illustration standards or merely reflected Newton's personal obsession. Amid these responsibilities, Newton continues his private research, granting him unique insights into emerging scientific trends. He authors society papers on lunar theory and solar parallax, blending observational data with his gravitational framework. In one memorable lecture, he demonstrates the refraction of winds through Cornish tin mine shafts using smoke and a makeshift wind vane, an ingeniously simple experiment that captivates attendees. Some scholars argue these public presentations reveal a more extroverted side of Newton seldom seen in his private notebooks. Newton's tenure as president spans over 2 decades, until his death in 1727. By then, he has steered the Royal Society into prominence as Europe's leading scientific institution. His quiet leadership style, marked by administrative rigor, methodological innovation, and occasional bursts of theatrical demonstration, cements his legacy not only as a brilliant investigator, but as a custodian of scientific collaboration. Historians still debate whether his presidency prioritized the advancement of knowledge or the consolidation of his own intellectual authority. Newton's role at the Royal Society illustrates his capacity to balance reclusive scholarship with public stewardship. He shapes the norms, practices, and aspirations of organized science while maintaining the solitary pursuits that defined his lifelong quest for hidden truths. As we proceed to Section 10 on personal correspondence, we will delve into the private letters and cryptic notes that offer intimate glimpses of his hidden self. Isaac Newton's surviving letters and notes reveal facets of his personality that his formal publications conceal, a widely accepted historical fact. Though renowned for terse academic writing, his private correspondence brims with dry humor, personal anxieties, and glimpses of a heart burdened by solitude. These letters, sent to confidants like John Locke, Henry Moore, and Nicolas Fatio de Duillier, form a mosaic of intimate reflections, revealing how the scholar grappled with friendship, faith, and the pressures of genius. In a 1693 letter to his friend Nicolas Fatio, Newton confesses bouts of insomnia and melancholic disturbances of the mind, following disputes at the Royal Society. He writes, "I have labored night and day, yet sleep eludes me, and my thoughts wander like untethered comets." This unguarded admission of mental strain offers a quirky contrast to his public persona of serene logic. Historians still debate whether these episodes constituted what we would now identify as clinical depression or were temporary responses to professional stress. Newton's letters often incorporate playful analogies drawn from his scientific work. In one lesser-known note to John Locke, he compares the process of philosophical inquiry to prismatic light. Just as a simple beam divides into hues when passed through glass, so does truth reveal countless facets under scrutiny. He then wryly adds a postscript. Alas, I fear many readers linger on the red end and ignore the violet. This metaphor demonstrates his belief in rigorous analysis while acknowledging human tendency toward selective attention. Some scholars argue that such analogies shaped his teaching style. Others caution that projecting pedagogical intent risks overstating their significance. His correspondence with Henry Moore unveils shared interests in alchemy and theology. In a coded letter, Newton encloses a ciphered recipe for an experiment involving the dissolution of the philosopher's egg in spirit of vitriol, urging Moore to keep it secret. A quirky detail: he writes the cipher key on a scrap of envelope lined with a sketch of a small furnace, complete with lopsided chimneys. This playful encryption underscores both his commitment to confidentiality and his enjoyment of intellectual puzzles. Historians still debate how much these alchemical exchanges influenced Barrow's decision to secure Newton's manuscripts rather than disseminate them. Newton's letters to confidants also display his keen interest in practical matters. He advises his niece, Catherine Barton, on household affairs, recommending she let the fire burn softly and stock only seasoned wood, lest the draughts disturb one's meditations. This domestic counsel, embedded within discussions of manuscript copying, reveals a man attuned to the interplay of environment and thought. Some biographers suggest these household tips reflect his broader belief in orderly surroundings as essential to deep work. Others argue they simply show familial care. Amid friendly banter, Newton's correspondence occasionally turns philosophical. In a missive to Locke, he debates the existence of absolute space and time, arguing that space is the sensorium of God, a phrase that encapsulates his conviction in God's immanence. He follows with a humorous caveat, "But let not mortal minds ponder this too long before supper." This blend of metaphysical speculation and mundane self-reminder highlights his capacity to balance lofty reflection with everyday pragmatism. Scholars still debate whether Newton intended such remarks as sincere doctrine or rhetorical devices to engage interlocutors. Newton's surviving cryptic notes, often written in the margins of books or on scraps of paper, provide further insight. One fragment, discovered in a volume on Roman coins, lists a sequence of Greek letters followed by numerical factors, likely a code for tracking alchemical yields or financial accounts at the mint. A quirky anecdote describes a student discovering this note tucked between pages and later presenting it to Lord Halifax, who exclaimed, "Only Newton would hide arithmetic in ancient script." Historians still debate the precise purpose of these ciphered lists and whether they pertain to experiments or bookkeeping. His letters also betray moments of unexpected vulnerability. In 1692, amid rumors of criticism over his optical theories, Newton writes to his old friend Wickens, "I fear that minds impatient of novelty conspire to dim the brightness of these prisms I cherish." This poetic lament anthropomorphizes his experiments as beloved companions under siege. Some scholars interpret this as evidence that Newton viewed his scientific work not merely as abstract research, but as personal creations deserving protection. Others caution against reading too much emotion into a single metaphor. Newton's personal correspondence ceases abruptly in his last years, replaced by curt financial memos and official reports at the Mint. Yet the surviving cache of intimate letters offers a window into the private self of a man accustomed to solitary rigor. They reveal an intellect at once playful and profound, anxious about recognition yet devoted to truth, and perpetually curious about both the mechanics of nature and the workings of the human heart. These letters and notes underscore Newton's complexity, a reclusive genius who sought connection through coded messages, witty metaphors, and candid admissions of struggle. They remind us that behind the Principia and Optics stood a human being wrestling with questions of faith, friendship, and mental well-being. As we transition to Section 11 on Cambridge governance, we will see how this private self informs his public responsibilities and administrative reforms. But the private letters he pens next will expose a vulnerability no one expected. Isaac Newton assumes the Lucasian professorship of mathematics at Trinity College in 1669, stepping into an academic governance role that he approaches with the same rigor he applies to celestial mechanics, a widely accepted historical fact. In this position, he holds responsibility for lecturing, examining candidates, and shaping the college's mathematical curriculum. Yet Newton's tenure extends well beyond formal duties. He becomes an influential arbiter of academic standards and institutional traditions, wielding authority in a realm he typically navigates alone. From his first lecture, Newton insists on precision and clarity. In one memorable address, he conjures geometric constructions on the chalkboard with sweeping arcs, illustrating conic sections so vividly that students later describe the diagrams as dancing curves rather than rigid figures. A quirky detail preserved in college lore recounts how Newton, dissatisfied with the dim oil lamps in the lecture hall, arranges a series of polished metal reflectors to amplify candlelight, creating a makeshift spotlight that bathes his chalked ellipses in brilliance. This inventive solution blends pedagogical care with hands-on ingenuity, transforming a simple lecture into an immersive experience. His administrative role requires more than teaching. As a senior fellow, Newton sits on the college's governance council, debating statutes, admissions policies, and disciplinary cases. He approaches each decision with analytic detachment. When contested applications arise, often involving legacy students whose families supply college endowments, he quietly reviews academic records and mathematical exercises, insisting that scholarship, not wealth or patronage, guide admissions. One lesser-known episode describes him secretly grading a prospective fellow's Latin theses and geometric proofs by lamplight, posting the anonymous evaluation to avert any bias. Historians still debate whether Newton's insistence on meritocratic standards laid early groundwork for modern academic fairness, or whether his solitary judgments bypassed collegial deliberation. Newton's influence also extends to curriculum reform. He revises the sequence of mathematical instruction, integrating his own lectures on fluxions alongside traditional courses in Euclid and arithmetic. In doing so, he elevates emerging analytical methods while preserving classical foundations. A quirky anecdote recounts him modeling a fluxional curve with a piece of string stretched across two nails hammered into a wooden board, demonstrating instantaneous change long before chalk touched the slate. Students marvel at this tactile approach, though some tutors grumble that such demonstrations verge on theatrics. Scholars still debate whether Newton's pedagogical innovations genuinely broadened mathematical understanding or catered to his own preference for visual proofs. Beyond academia, Newton navigates financial stewardship as a member of the college bursary committee. He audits accounts, supervises repair projects of college buildings, and negotiates contracts with local craftsmen. In one amusing footnote, he challenges a mason's assertion that certain stone blocks are weatherproof, insisting on performing an impromptu hardness test in which he chips a fragment with his penknife. His colleagues recall seeing him pocket the chipped stone, later scribbling hardness values in his notebook alongside optical data. This blend of scientific curiosity and administrative oversight intrigues some and exasperates others, prompting debates about the proper boundaries between scholarship and stewardship. Disciplinary matters fall under Newton's purview as well. When a novice scholar is accused of forging lecture notes, an offense that threatens the college's reputation, Newton chairs the inquiry, applying systematic questioning rather than rhetoric. He examines the suspect's handwriting against known notebooks, uses a candle to inspect ink consistency, and even compares impressions of the candidate's personal seal. A quirky detail surfaces in the hearing records. Newton carries a small hand lens in his pocket specifically for such examinations. Historians still debate whether his investigative zeal in disciplinary cases fostered a culture of accountability or instilled fear among junior fellows. Despite these public responsibilities, Newton safeguards time for private research. He negotiates with the college bursar to secure blocks of research leave, granting him extended periods to withdraw from administrative meetings. In return, he submits annual reports on his instructional activities and students' progress. One report, written in Newton's meticulous copperplate, outlines proposed lecture topics for the coming year, ranging from advanced binomial expansions to experimental optics. A less-known detail mentions his request for an experimental apparatus procured from the college workshop, underscoring his desire to merge teaching with demonstration. Scholars still debate whether such formal arrangements signaled early recognition of sabbatical practices or reflected Newton's unique bargaining power as a celebrated scholar. Newton's governance reaches its apex when he mediates disputes between Trinity's fellows and the university's chancellor. Tensions flare over jurisdictional overlaps in academic oversight and use of college facilities. Newton negotiates compromises that preserve the college's autonomy while acknowledging broader university protocols. One anecdote records him presenting a carefully drafted set of revised statutes carved into beeswax tablets, a symbolic gesture emphasizing the malleability of rules tempered by careful deliberation. Historians still debate whether Newton's interventions strengthened collegiate self-governance or simply reinforced hierarchical structures in the collegiate system. As years pass, Newton's administrative responsibilities grow. He mentors younger fellows, offering guidance on publication strategies and experimental design. In a less celebrated but revealing incident, he invites a novice chemist to demonstrate distillation techniques in his private chambers, a rare concession that highlights Newton's willingness to support peers' work. Yet he seldom extends such privileges broadly, maintaining the privacy that served him throughout his own research. Scholars still debate whether his selective mentorship cultivated excellence among protégés or perpetuated an exclusive scholarly circle. Newton's departure from Cambridge governance is as understated as his tenure. With his election as Master of the Mint and increasing duties in London, he resigns his Lucasian professorship in 1701. His final governance act, submitting a comprehensive report on college finances and curriculum revisions, emphasizes sustainability and adaptability. A quirky postscript in the report muses that a well-ordered institution resembles a well-tuned instrument, encapsulating his vision of academic life as a harmonious blend of structure and creativity. This parting reflection resonates through Trinity's subsequent reforms, shaping its evolution into a modern center of learning. Newton's service in Cambridge governance demonstrates his capacity to apply analytical thought to institutional leadership. He balances scholarly innovation with administrative precision, infusing collegiate traditions with meritocratic ideals and pedagogical creativity. Historians still debate whether his governance style served as a model for Enlightenment academic reforms or remained idiosyncratic to his formidable personality. As we move into Section 12 on scientific rivalries, we will explore how these administrative experiences inform his interactions with contemporaries like Robert Hooke and John Flamsteed. Isaac Newton's towering intellect and exacting standards make him a formidable rival to contemporaries such as Robert Hooke and Edmund Halley, a widely accepted historical fact. His interactions with these peers reveal both the brilliance of his ideas and the fierceness of his defenses. Historians still debate whether these rivalries propelled scientific progress or stifled collaborative spirit in 17th-century natural philosophy. Newton's first clash with Robert Hooke erupts over the nature of light. Hooke, championing a wave theory, presents experiments in the Royal Society in 1672 suggesting light behaves as a series of vibrations. A quirky detail from Newton's annotations recounts him sketching Hooke's diffraction patterns in his private notebook, noting in margin that Hooke's diffraction patterns, waves cause more ripples in reputation than in air. Newton counters by devising his prism experiments, demonstrating that white light separates into a spectrum, a claim Hooke initially disputes. This public contest culminates in heated correspondence, where Newton labels Hooke's criticisms as vague conjectures and accuses him of misrepresenting data. Scholars still debate whether Newton's dismissive tone hindered constructive debate or sharpened his resolve to refine experimental rigor. Edmund Halley enters the rivalry with a more congenial rapport. In 1684, Halley travels to Cambridge to consult Newton on planetary orbits, sparking discussions that lead to the genesis of the Principia. A quirky anecdote describes Halley presenting Newton with a new set of logarithmic tables carved into polished wood, to which Newton responds by forging his own set of celestial tables overnight. Their mutual respect fosters breakthroughs, yet diverging temperaments eventually strain their collaboration. While Halley advocates for prompt publication and clear exposition, Newton remains meticulous, delaying release of Principia's second edition for years. Historians still debate whether Halley's editorial pressures unfairly burdened Newton, or whether they ensured the work's enduring clarity. John Flamsteed, the first Astronomer Royal, experiences rivalry tinged with piety. Newton relies on Flamsteed's stellar observations for lunar and solar calculations, yet he grows impatient with Flamsteed's cautious release of data. In 1712, Newton, as president of the Royal Society, publishes a preliminary copy of Flamsteed's star catalogue without consent, an act that creates lasting bitterness. A quirky footnote in Flamsteed's diary records his outrage upon discovering his meticulously drawn star charts bound in a volume bearing Newton's corrections in red ink. Scholars still debate whether Newton's appropriation of Flamsteed's work reflects overreach or urgent scientific necessity. The tension with Hooke extends to motion's mathematical description. Hooke claims priority over the inverse square law, asserting he suggested it to Newton in personal correspondence. Newton vehemently denies this, documenting in notebooks a derivation predating Hooke's letters. A quirky margin note scrawled decades later reads, "If Hooke spoke, he spoke too late for history's ears." This dispute over intellectual credit festers until Hooke's death, leaving unresolved questions about the true origin of gravitational theory. Historians still debate the extent of Hooke's contributions and whether Newton's reticence to collaborate undermined communal discovery. Other rivalries manifest in debates over cometary motions, where Newton's mathematical models clash with Halley's empirical observations. Halley pushes for a return to epicyclic theories used by Ptolemaic astronomers, though expressed in modern terms, while Newton insists on an elliptical framework consistent with his gravitational law. Their correspondence, filled with polite deference yet underlying tension, showcases the transition from qualitative to quantitative science. A quirky anecdote tells of Newton sending Halley a live snowflake encased in wax to illustrate ice crystal symmetries, an experiment meant to underscore the universality of geometric forms. Scholars still debate whether such demonstrative gifts eased friction or merely highlighted Newton's penchant for theatrical persuasion. Amid this network of rivalries, Newton contends with John Flamsteed's own protégé, Abraham Sharp, who critiques Newton's lunar theory in published pamphlets. Newton responds with a detailed rejoinder, publishing a rebuttal under royal auspices that corrects Sharp's numerical errors. This official refutation cements Newton's authority, but also sparks criticism that he wields institutional power to silence dissent. Historians still debate whether these reprisals protected scientific integrity or reflected Newton's insecurity about his theories. Despite clashes, Newton occasionally extends olive branches. He acknowledges Halley's assistance in the Principia's publication with a dedication that praises Halley's steadfast friendship and sagacious counsel. This public tribute counters private barbs, suggesting Newton valued collaborative achievement even amid personal pride. Likewise, after Hooke's death, he funds a memorial lecture in Hooke's honor, an act some interpret as reconciliation, others as retrospective assertion of magnanimity. Newton's scientific rivalries, marked by both acrimony and respect, drive the maturation of modern science. Personal tensions force precise articulation of ideas, while competitive urgency accelerates experimental innovation. Historians still debate whether the adversarial climate overshadowed cooperative potential, or whether it mirrored broader cultural shifts toward individual scientific recognition. As we transition to Section 13 on mental strains, we will examine how these rivalries impacted Newton's psychological well-being and later life. And when his fiercest rival stands defeated, an unexpected alliance will propel him to new heights. Isaac Newton's relentless pursuit of knowledge and his fierce scholarly rivalries exact a toll on his mental well-being, a widely accepted historical fact. Although celebrated for his extraordinary intellect, private accounts and correspondence hint at episodes of anxiety, insomnia, and emotional distress that shadow his later years. Historians still debate whether these struggles stemmed primarily from innate temperament, the pressures of his responsibilities, or the isolating nature of his genius. By the late 1690s, Newton's diaries record frequent nights spent unable to sleep, his mind racing through unresolved mathematical proofs and alchemical conundrums. In a lesser-known entry dated March 1698, he writes, "My thoughts chase one another like specters in a deserted hall, revealing vivid imagery of mental unrest." This metaphorical language contrasts sharply with his public composure and has led some scholars to speculate he experienced what we might now label clinical insomnia or anxiety. Quirky marginal notes in his personal notebooks describe him wrapping a woolen scarf tightly around his head in an attempt to dull the ache behind his eyes, an improvised remedy for the throbbing tension he felt after hours of candlelit study. Newton's tenure at the Mint and presidency of the Royal Society compound these pressures. He shoulders the burden of prosecuting counterfeiters, overseeing complex coinage reforms, and guiding Britain's foremost scientific body, duties that leave little time for respite. In a private letter to John Locke, he confesses, "The clangor of dies in the tower sometimes echoes in my mind when I seek the quiet of thought." This admission underscores the difficulty of switching off administrative duties to return to contemplative research. Some biographers argue that this blurred boundary between cognitive labor and bureaucratic service exacerbated his stress, while others maintain his work ethic naturally blended both realms without clear demarcation. The calculus controversy with Leibniz further strains his psyche. Despite ultimately prevailing in the priority dispute, Newton privately expresses regret over the rancorous tenor of the debate. In a confidential note, he muses, "The fire of contention drowns the subtle glow of discovery," acknowledging that adversarial exchanges can overshadow scientific insight. This self-reflection suggests he recognized the psychological cost of intellectual combat, yet felt compelled by a strong sense of honor and the defense of his life's work. Contemporaries observe Newton's reclusive habits intensify. He avoids public dinners and declines social invitations, preferring the solitude of his chambers. A quirky anecdote relates that he once instructed his servant to remove all footstools from the drawing room so that guests could not linger and distract him from his studies. While some view this behavior as eccentricity befitting a great mind, others interpret it as a coping mechanism to shield his mental space from external demands. In his late 50s, Newton experiences what he terms fits of melancholia, episodes lasting days during which he abandons all work, consuming only bread and milk. Family letters describe him wandering the Kensington Gardens at dusk, murmuring inaudible calculations. These episodes bear resemblance to what modern psychiatry might categorize as depressive episodes. Yet Newton leaves no explicit medical record, and scholars still debate whether these were brief bouts of despair or part of a more chronic condition. To manage stress, Newton adopts several personal rituals. He walks each morning to a secluded orchard, where he practices deep breathing and records natural observations, an early form of contemplative forest bathing. In one rare surviving sketch, he draws concentric circles in the soil around his chosen tree, marking intervals between breaths and sun positions. Some historians see this as evidence of mindfulness practices. Others argue he simply used walks to gather empirical data for optics experiments. Newton's late correspondence reveals a gradual softening of his rigor. In letters to Catherine Barton, he expresses gratitude for moments of familial warmth. "Your laughter echoes like a reprieve in my halls of thought." These tender notes contrast his earlier stoicism and suggest that interpersonal connections provided a buffer against solitary strain. Historians still debate the extent to which personal relationships alleviated his mental burdens versus his scientific pursuits themselves serving as both cure and cause. In his 70s, Newton's health declines, and his letters speak of fading vigor of mind and windows of memory growing dim. Yet even as cognitive sharpness wanes, he maintains remarkable clarity in revisiting earlier notebooks and offering corrections to Principia proofs. In an almost quixotic gesture, he polishes a final batch of celestial tables by candlelight, as though reaffirming mastery over both outer and inner chaos. This late-life dedication underscores his belief that intellectual labor offered solace amid encroaching frailty. Newton's mental strains, though often concealed behind disciplined scholarship, form an integral part of his hidden life. They illustrate how the burdens of genius, high expectations, fierce competition, and relentless solitude can exact a personal cost. As we approach section 14 on final solitude, we will witness how Newton navigates the twilight years of his extraordinary journey. In the final decade of his life, Isaac Newton retreats ever deeper into solitude, finding both refuge and reflection in the quiet corridors of his Kensington residence, a widely accepted historical fact. Having relinquished most public duties, he spends increasing hours alone, poring over early manuscripts and revisiting experiments that first ignited his wonder. Historians still debate whether this withdrawal stems from fading health, lingering distrust of colleagues, or a deliberate turn inward to consolidate his intellectual legacy. Newton's daily routine in later years begins before dawn. He awakens in a modest chamber furnished with simple oak furnishings and a small writing desk draped with green baize. A quirky detail recorded by his niece, Catherine Barton, notes that he lines the desk drawer with felt to muffle the sound of quill pens being laid to rest, a silent ritual reflecting his desire for undisturbed contemplation. Rising candles accompany his reading of favorite Platonic texts, though by this time he annotates them with critiques that foreshadow modern hermeneutics. Some scholars argue these late-stage commentaries reveal a matured philosophical stance. Others caution against attributing undue systematic consistency to what may be scattered marginalia. Physical ailments increasingly complicate Newton's solitude. Reports from his attending physician describe intermittent bouts of gout that confine him to a cushioned chaise for days. In one letter, Newton wryly observes that the flame of thought endures even when the flesh protests, a quirky turn of phrase underscoring his resilient mind. Despite pain, he continues to rehearse proofs from the Principia, correcting typographical errors and refining errata lists, acts that demonstrate his enduring commitment to precision. Historians still debate whether these corrections constitute substantive intellectual contributions or represent compulsive attention to minutiae inherent in his character. Newton's attic laboratory, once bustling during the plague year, now lies largely undisturbed. He preserves his reflecting telescope and prism apparatuses behind velvet curtains, inspecting them occasionally by lamplight. A lesser-known anecdote describes him unsealing a dusty vial of vegetable spirit from his alchemical notebooks and gazing through it at a flickering lamp, as though searching for residual translucence of past experiments. This image of a reclusive alchemist-scientist meditating over faded curiosities encapsulates his lifelong quest to reconcile empirical observation with metaphysical meaning. Historians still debate whether Newton regarded these artifacts as vestiges of youthful passion or as touchstones for unresolved inquiries. Social visits become rare. Newton declines most invitations from former colleagues, though he occasionally grants audiences to a favored few, often under strict conditions of silence and punctuality. Catherine Barton recounts one such meeting. She escorted John Conduit, her husband, to Newton's study, where the master greeted him with perfunctory courtesy before returning to a manuscript. Conduit notes that Newton quietly placed a leather-bound volume on the desk without comment, an unspoken trust that the visitor would understand its significance. Some interpret this gesture as a final passing of intellectual torch. Others see it as an emblem of Newton's guarded generosity. Spiritual reflection intensifies in Newton's final years. He composes brief devotional meditations, blending scriptural verses with natural philosophy. One surviving meditation juxtaposes Psalm 19's "Heavens declare the glory of God" with his own observations of sunspots, arguing that even celestial imperfections testify to divine craftsmanship. A quirky marginal sketch depicts a dark sunspot ringed by rays etched like lace, a poetic fusion of theological and optical imagery. Scholars still debate whether Newton penned these reflections to assuage existential concerns or as genuine theological exploration. Newton's financial affairs preoccupy him as well. He reviews mint accounts one last time, ensuring all ledgers reconcile and relinquishing oversight to trusted deputies. In a whimsical footnote, he allocates a small bequest to fund annual prizes for outstanding mathematical essays at Cambridge. a gesture echoing his own early sizarship and commitment to supporting future scholars. Historians still debate whether this endowment reflects Newton's desire for posthumous recognition or a sincere effort to nurture youthful talent. In private letters to Catherine Barton, Newton speaks candidly of his impending mortality. On one occasion, he writes, "The day approaches when even the brightest fluxion must cease," invoking his calculus metaphor to frame death as the ultimate waning moment. This poignant analogy reveals his inclination to articulate life's finality through the language of his own discoveries. Some biographers view this as evidence of serene acceptance. Others suggest a melancholic resignation that haunted him in twilight hours. Newton's interactions with his few remaining correspondents reveal a softened tone. He thanks Henry Pemberton for help with errata in the third edition of the Principia and expresses relief that his magnum opus will endure. A quirky aside in one letter notes that Pemberton's transcriptions shine as white as the apples that first inspired these laws, referencing Newton's famed orchard observation. Historians still debate whether such warmth signals genuine camaraderie or functions as disciplined rhetoric, masking deeper withdrawal. As age dims his eyesight, Newton delegates detailed review of texts to trusted aides, marking corrections by dictating to scribes. He retains authority over final proofs, however, insisting that no alteration proceed without his explicit approval. This tenacity underscores his enduring perfectionism. Even in physical decline, he refuses to cede control over his intellectual reputation. Scholars still debate whether such oversight prolonged his creative contributions or reflected an inability to relinquish early works. Newton's final days are marked by a gradual waning of both body and spirit. He passes away on March 31, 1727, in his sleep, leaving behind a neatly ordered desk and unopened correspondence, testaments to a life governed by disciplined solitude. In accordance with his wishes, his funeral at Westminster Abbey proceeds with minimal ceremony, reflecting his aversion to public spectacle. A final quirky note from Abbey records mentions the presence of a single black feather, possibly dropped by a mourning raven perched on a nearby column, an evocative symbol unrecorded in Newton's own writings. Historians still debate whether this feather's appearance merits symbolic interpretation or remains an anecdotal coincidence. Newton's final solitude thus encapsulates a life of profound inquiry, shaped by both seclusion and sustained engagement with the deepest questions of nature and faith. His twilight years reveal how a reclusive genius confronts mortality, balancing reflective calm with last vestiges of scholarly rigor. As we turn to Section 15 on enduring legacy, we will consider how this hidden life resonates across centuries of scientific and cultural thought. As his final solitude deepens, a revelation waits in the shadows that will cement his immortal legacy. Isaac Newton's multifaceted life continues to echo through scientific, cultural, and philosophical realms, cementing his status as a foundational figure in modern thought, a widely accepted historical fact. More than 3 centuries after his death, scholars still debate the full extent of his hidden contributions, from alchemical insights to theological speculations. Newton's legacy unfolds in 3 intertwined strands: the scientific revolution he sparked, the scholarly disputes he inspired, and the cultural mythos that grew around his persona. First, Newton's scientific achievements form the backbone of classical physics. His laws of motion and universal gravitation underpin centuries of research, enabling feats from celestial navigation to space exploration. Yet beneath these towering accomplishments lie hidden threads. Historians still investigate how his unpublished fluxional methods influenced later developments in analysis and differential equations. Quirky rediscoveries of his early manuscripts have revealed proto-topological ideas such as his sketches of continuous curves that prefigure modern notions of continuity and convergence. These marginalia hint that Newton's true mathematical breadth exceeded even what he formally published, suggesting untapped veins of insight waiting to be mined by contemporary scholars. Second, the controversies Newton engaged in over calculus priority, optical theory, and historical chronology catalyzed the evolution of academic practices. His role in establishing anonymous peer review at the Royal Society set precedents for scholarly rigor, even as debates over his impartiality raise enduring questions about power dynamics in science. Historians still debate whether the Commercium Epistolicum reflects an ethical compromise or an early assertion of intellectual property. Likewise, his fierce disputes with Hooke and Flamsteed reveal how personal rivalries can sharpen arguments, but also risk fracturing collaborative communities. These historical episodes serve as cautionary tales, reminding modern researchers that the social structures surrounding science profoundly shape its progress. Third, Newton's mythic persona, reclusive genius, alchemist, devout heretic, has permeated popular culture and inspired countless artistic and literary portrayals. The image of Newton beneath the apple tree, lost in solitary reflection, endures as a symbol of individual insight triumphing over ignorance. Yet recent scholarship complicates this romantic narrative, emphasizing the communal networks, patronage systems, and institutional supports that enabled his work. Historians still debate how much his solitary laboratory experiments depended on resources from the Royal Society and how his public influence derived from political alliances at the Mint. This nuanced view encourages a more balanced appreciation of scientific achievement as both personal and collective endeavor. Newton's legacy also informs contemporary dialogues on the relationship between science and faith. His rejection of orthodox Trinitarian doctrine and his prophetic chronologies challenge the perceived divide between rational inquiry and spiritual belief. Modern theologians and philosophers explore Newtonian theology as a precursor to Enlightenment deism and as a case study in integrating scientific and religious worldviews. Historians still debate whether Newton's eschatological projections warrant serious theological consideration or remain curiosities of a brilliant but idiosyncratic mind. Educationally, Newton's pedagogical innovations, fluxional curves drawn with string, sundials carved from quills, anticipate hands-on learning approaches that emphasize experiential understanding. His insistence on clear demonstration and empirical validation resonates with modern STEM education principles. Scholars still debate how directly his 17th-century methods influenced later curricula, yet his blend of visual, tactile, and analytical modes of teaching remains a model for engaging learners. Finally, Newton's hidden life invites reflection on the nature of genius itself. His blend of solitary rigor, administrative mastery, and theological depth suggests that exceptional creativity often requires both intense focus and broad intellectual curiosity. Historians still debate whether isolating environments like his Woolsthorpe retreat foster insight, or whether collaborative settings better stimulate innovation. This question echoes in contemporary discussions about research funding, open science, and the balance between individual scholarship and team-based inquiry. In sum, Isaac Newton's enduring legacy transcends his published works, encompassing unpublished manuscripts, institutional reforms, theological reflections, and cultural symbolism. His life illustrates how the pursuit of knowledge intertwines with personal idiosyncrasies, social structures, and historical contingencies. As we continue to unlock his hidden contributions, Newton's story invites us to consider the complex tapestry of factors that shape scientific discovery and to ask anew, What undiscovered insights lie dormant in the margins of history? Isaac Newton's hidden life reveals a figure whose intellectual reach extended far beyond the laws of motion and universal gravitation. His secluded childhood, plague-era experiments, alchemical quests, and theological deliberations each contributed layers to a complex legacy. Newton's work at the Royal Mint and presidency of the Royal Society demonstrate his capacity to apply scientific rigor to administrative challenges, while his rivalries and mental strains highlight the personal costs of groundbreaking discovery. The manuscripts he withheld, the debates he instigated, and the private writings he secured all underscore that the journey of scientific insight is rarely linear or confined to public view. Reflecting on Newton's enduring impact, we see that his published achievements represent only a fraction of his contributions. Ongoing scholarly debates about his unpublished fluxions, esoteric treatises, and institutional innovations remind us that the boundaries of knowledge constantly expand as we revisit historical figures with fresh perspectives. Newton's integration of scientific, theological, and philosophical pursuits challenges contemporary divides between disciplines, suggesting a model of inquiry that embraces complexity and nuance. Ultimately, Newton's hidden life invites us to ponder the nature of intellectual legacy. What other overlooked details in archives may reshape our understanding of scientific progress? How do personal convictions and social contexts intertwine to foster or hinder discovery? As we continue to explore the margins of Newton's manuscripts and the annals of history, we honor not only his monumental achievements, but also the collaborative and often cryptic processes by which knowledge advances. What mysteries remain buried in the notebooks of geniuses past, waiting to illuminate the path forward for future seekers of truth?